He stopped in the doorway. For 3 weeks, his daughter hadn't eaten a single bite, and now she was lifting food to her mouth. Alexander Blackwell's hand flew to his lips as his breath caught. The billionaire who could buy anything in the world stood there, frozen, watching a miracle he never believed would happen. 3 weeks earlier, the doctors had said there was nothing wrong with her. Sophia Blackwell was healthy, her organs were fine, her blood work was perfect. And yet every day she grew smaller. The meals returned untouched, the plates stayed full, the silence inside the mansion grew heavier. Alexander summoned the best specialists money could reach, nutritionists, pediatric experts, therapists who had spent their lives saving children just like her. They examined, observed, prescribed, and left. None of them had answers. Sophia didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared past everyone as if she were waiting for someone who never came. Her father watched from doorways. He offered toys. He promised trips. He begged. But the one thing he didn't realize she needed, he never gave. Then the new maid arrived. Naomi Carter didn't carry a clipboard. She didn't ask questions. She didn't touch the food. She pulled out a chair, sat beside the child, and waited. Before you begin, please take a moment to relax and enjoy the story. If you find it engaging, do me a small favor. Subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. I'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your support means a lot and helps grow our community. The first signs were easy to dismiss. Sophia didn't cry for food anymore. She didn't reach for the spoon or slap her tiny hands against the table the way she used to. When breakfast was placed in front of her, she simply looked at it, quiet, distant, as if the plate belonged to someone else. The nurse smiled gently and said she was probably teething. Children go through phases. Lunch came and went untouched. By dinner, the smile was gone. The next day, the same thing happened. Fresh meals, warm milk, carefully prepared food meant to tempt even the pickiest child. Sophia turned her face away. Not in anger, not in protest, just a slow, deliberate refusal, like someone closing a door and locking it from the inside. By the third day, the house began to change. Servants spoke in whispers. Plates were cleared too quickly, as if leaving them too long made the truth harder to ignore. The dining room, once filled with soft laughter and clinking cutlery, became a place no one wanted to linger. Sophia grew lighter in Alexander's arms, her body softer, her energy fading in small but frightening ways. She stopped playing with her toys. The stuffed rabbit she once dragged everywhere lay forgotten on the floor. When spoken to, she blinked slowly, her eyes dull, her gaze fixed on something no one else could see. Doctors were called. At first, it was routine. Weight checks, blood tests, calm voices offering reassurance. She's healthy, strong heart, no infections. Children do this sometimes. But Sophia didn't stop. A week passed, then another. Meals became ceremonies of dread. The nanny. The first signs were easy to dismiss. Sophia didn't cry for food anymore. She didn't reach for the spoon or slap her tiny hands against the table the way she used to. When breakfast was placed in front of her, she simply looked at it, quiet, distant, as if the plate belonged to someone else. The nurse smiled gently and said she was probably teething. Children go through phases. Lunch came and went untouched. By dinner, the smile was gone. The next day, the same thing happened. Fresh meals, warm milk, carefully prepared food meant to tempt even the pickiest child. Sophia turned her face away. Not in anger, not in protest, just a slow, deliberate refusal, like someone closing a door and locking it from the inside. By the third day, the house began to change. Servants spoke in whispers. Plates were cleared too quickly, as if leaving them too long made the truth harder to ignore. The dining room, once filled with soft laughter and clinking cutlery, became a place no one wanted to linger. Sophia grew lighter in Alexander's arms, her body softer, her energy fading in small but frightening ways. She stopped playing with her toys. The stuffed rabbit she once dragged everywhere lay forgotten on the floor. When spoken to, she blinked slowly, her eyes dull, her gaze fixed on something no one else could see. Doctors were called. At first, it was routine. Weight checks, blood tests, calm voices offering reassurance. She's healthy, strong heart, no infections. Children do this sometimes. But Sophia didn't stop. A week passed, then another. Meals became ceremonies of dread. The nanny tried singing. Another tried games. Someone else tried pleading, tears slipping down her face as she begged a toddler who didn't seem to hear her. Sophia pushed the spoon away every time, her lips pressed together, her small hands resting limply in her lap. Alexander watched it all from a distance. He stood in doorways, leaning against walls, pretending to take phone calls while his eyes stayed locked on his daughter. Each time a plate came back full, something tightened in his chest. He told himself she would eat tomorrow. He told himself the experts knew best. He told himself not to panic, but panic crept in anyway. By the second week, Sophia's cheeks had hollowed slightly. Her clothes hung looser on her tiny frame. She slept more, cried less, and when she did cry, it sounded thin, like a sound pulled from too far away. The house felt heavier with every passing day. Even the air seemed tense, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Staff members avoided eye contact with Alexander. No one knew what to say to a man who could buy islands but couldn't convince his own child to eat a single bite of food. By the third week, fear was no longer hidden. Doctors came more often. Specialists spoke in low, serious tones. Charts were studied again and again as if the answer might suddenly appear if they stared long enough. Feeding schedules were rewritten. New techniques were tried. None of it mattered. Sophia refused every meal. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply faded, day by day, in the quietest way possible. And in the silence of that enormous mansion, everyone understood the same terrifying truth. If something didn't change soon, this child, this precious, fragile life, would slip away right in front of them, and no amount of money could stop it. The first specialist arrived by private jet, then another, and another. Alexander stopped asking how much it cost. The numbers no longer mattered. If there was someone in the world who could fix this, he wanted them standing in his house, looking at his daughter, finding the answer everyone else had missed. The dining room became a temporary clinic. Machines hummed softly. Charts were spread across polished tables. Men and women in crisp coats spoke in careful, measured tones, using words meant to calm, not explain. Blood tests came back clean. Her heart was strong. Her organs were functioning perfectly. "She's healthy," they said again. The words sounded cruel now. Sophia sat on her high chair as she always had, her legs dangling, her hands resting on the tray. A spoon hovered near her lips. She turned her head away, slowly, calmly, without effort. It was as if eating no longer existed in her world. A child psychologist tried first. He lowered himself to her level, spoke gently, offered toys, smiled often. He waited. He encouraged. Nothing. Sophia stared past him, unmoved. A feeding specialist followed. She adjusted textures, temperatures, colors, warm food, cold food, sweet, savory, familiar, new. Each meal was designed with precision and experience. Each one went untouched. Alexander listened as they debated possibilities, sensory aversion, trauma, regression, words stacked on top of one another, building theories that never reached the truth. When he asked what was wrong with his daughter, no one gave him an answer that felt real. There was nothing to fix. That was the problem.
They tried structured routines, they tried gentle pressure, they tried sitting her down longer, shortening meals, turning food into games. Sophia remained unmoved, her refusal steady and unshaken. Days blurred together. Alexander slept less. His phone rang constantly, but he stopped answering calls unrelated to Sophia. Board meetings were canceled. Deals were postponed. For the first time in his life, control slipped through his fingers. He sat across from one doctor late one evening, the dining room lights dimmed, the untouched plate still sitting between them. "Could she die?" Alexander asked quietly. The doctor hesitated, just long enough. "If this continues," he said, choosing his words carefully, "yes." The word settled into the room like a weight. Alexander nodded, his jaw tightening, his gaze fixed on the table. He had faced lawsuits, hostile takeovers, and financial disasters without flinching. None of them had ever made him feel this small. They suggested hospital admission, feeding tubes, interventions that sounded more like surrender than solutions. Alexander agreed to everything, then changed his mind, then agreed again. Nothing felt right, because deep down he sensed it. This wasn't a medical problem. Something had broken that no machine could measure, no scan could reveal. His daughter wasn't sick in the way they understood sickness. She wasn't fighting food. She was withdrawing from the world. Sophia grew quieter with each passing day. Her eyes followed nothing. Her body accepted being moved, cleaned, examined, like she had already learned resistance was useless. The doctors eventually left, one by one, offering polite apologies and thin reassurances. "We'll keep monitoring. Call us if anything changes. We're doing everything we can." When the house finally fell silent again, Alexander stood alone in the dining room, staring at the empty chair where his daughter had sat. For the first time, the truth settled in fully. His money had brought the best minds in the world into his home, and none of them could tell him why his child was starving herself, and none of them could save her. Alexander began to position himself just outside the room. He told himself it was to give the nurses space, to avoid overwhelming Sophia, to let the professionals work. But in truth, he stayed there because stepping inside felt unbearable. From the doorway, he could watch without being seen, feel without acting, hope without risking rejection. He leaned against the doorframe as meals were served. He watched the careful movements, the slow approach of the spoon, the pause, the quiet refusal. Each time Sophia turned her head away, something twisted in his chest. He wanted to step forward, to scoop her into his arms, to promise her anything if she would just eat. Instead, he stayed still. Alexander had built his life on providing. When there was a problem, he solved it with resources. When someone needed help, he wrote a check. Love, in his world, had always meant protection through abundance. Bigger houses, better schools, the best doctors money could buy. He had never learned how to be present when money stopped working. Sometimes he sat nearby, scrolling through his phone without reading a single word, pretending to be busy while his eyes drifted back to his daughter. He listened to the nurses speak softly to her, watched them kneel to her level, saw the patience in their faces. He admired it and envied it. When Sophia was lifted from her chair, she didn't reach for him. When he tried to hold her, her body stayed limp, accepting but distant. The absence hurt more than anger ever could have. At night, when the house grew quiet, Alexander walked the halls alone. He paused outside Sophia's room, listening to her soft, shallow breathing. More than once, his hand hovered over the door handle, unsure whether to go in or walk away. He chose the hallway more often than not. Guilt settled into him like a second skin. He replayed moments he had ignored, missed meals, postponed bedtime stories, evenings when work had taken precedence over sitting on the floor with his child. He had told himself there would always be time later. Now, time felt like a threat. Yet, even as guilt pressed down on him, he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know how to speak to a child who refused everything. He didn't know how to fix silence. There were no instructions, no clear steps, no strategy that guaranteed results. So he did what he knew. He ordered more tests, he called more experts, he rearranged schedules and staff, he paid for solutions he hoped would appear simply because he was willing to spend enough. From the doorway, he watched plates come and go untouched. From the doorway, he watched Sophia grow smaller. The staff noticed. They saw how he hovered but never fully entered, how he asked for updates instead of sitting beside his daughter. No one said anything. No one dared. Alexander told himself he was protecting her, that his presence might pressure her, that distance was safer. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, the truth whispered through the silence. He was afraid. Afraid that if he tried and failed, the guilt would crush him. Afraid that if he reached out and she didn't respond, it would confirm the fear he refused to name, that somehow, in all his success, he had failed at the one thing that mattered most. So he stayed in the doorway, close enough to see everything, too far away to change anything, and with each passing day, the distance between father and daughter grew heavier than the walls of the mansion around them.
Naomi Carter arrived on a quiet morning when the house already felt exhausted from holding its breath. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance. No hurried movements, no anxious questions, no rehearsed sympathy. She wore a simple uniform, her hair neatly pulled back, her posture calm. She greeted the housekeeper softly, nodded to the staff, and began her work without ceremony. Alexander barely noticed her. She moved through the mansion quietly, learning its rhythms, absorbing its silences. While others avoided the dining room at mealtimes, Naomi passed through it naturally, clearing plates, wiping tables, leaving no trace of herself behind. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then her words were brief and gentle. But when she saw Sophia, she slowed. The child sat in her chair as she always did, small and still, her eyes distant. Nurses hovered nearby, their attention divided between concern and routine. Naomi paused, just for a moment, her hands still, her gaze resting on Sophia's face. She didn't smile too quickly, she didn't reach out, she simply looked. Over the next few days, Naomi began to notice things no one else seemed to have time for. How Sophia's fingers tightened slightly when someone raised their voice. How her eyes followed movement only when it was slow and unthreatening. How she relaxed, not much, but just enough, when no one was asking her anything. Naomi adjusted her pace around the child. She moved more slowly. She made less noise. When she cleaned nearby, she kept her back turned, giving Sophia space without leaving. At meals, she watched from the edge of the room. She saw how the spoon always arrived with expectation, how the adults leaned forward unconsciously, holding their breath as if willing the child to eat. She noticed how Sophia turned away not in fear, but in quiet certainty. One afternoon, Naomi found herself alone in the dining room as a tray was cleared away untouched. Sophia remained seated, staring at the table. Without thinking, Naomi sat down a few feet away on a low chair meant for staff breaks. She didn't speak, she made no attempt to change the moment. She simply shared the space, breathing evenly, present without demand. Sophia shifted slightly in her seat. The house remained tense. Doctors still came and went. Fear still lived in every corner. But in the quiet between the larger efforts, something subtle began to take shape, something fragile and easily missed. Naomi wasn't trying to save the child. She was listening. And in a house filled with noise disguised as help, that quiet attention was the first thing that made Sophia feel seen.
By the fifth day, Naomi had learned the rhythm of Sophia's silence. She knew when the nurses would arrive with trays balanced carefully in their hands, when the room would tense, when every adult would lean forward without meaning to. She knew the exact moment Sophia's gaze would drift away, the calm certainty with which she closed herself off from the plate in front of her. And she knew what not to do. Naomi never touched the spoon meant for the child. She never knelt too close or spoke in that soft, pleading tone everyone else used. When food arrived, she did not look at Sophia at all. Instead, she brought her own small plate. She sat down on the low chair beside the table, not directly in front of Sophia, but close enough to share the space. She adjusted her posture slowly, as if every movement was intentional, as if there was all the time in the world. Then she began to eat. No performance, no encouragement, no words. Just the simple act of taking a bite, chewing quietly, and swallowing. At first, Sophia did nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the table, her hands resting where they always did. The room stayed tense, the nurses exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment pass. Naomi kept eating. She didn't rush, she didn't slow down either. She took each bite the same way, calmly, predictably, creating a rhythm that had nothing to do with expectation. After several minutes, Sophia's eyes flickered, just for a second. They moved from the table to Naomi's hands. Naomi noticed, but she did not respond. She continued eating, breathing evenly, her presence steady and unchanging. Another bite passed, then another. Sophia shifted in her chair, a small movement, barely noticeable. Her fingers curled slightly against the tray. Her eyes returned to Naomi, this time lingering longer, studying the way food moved from plate to mouth, the way nothing bad seemed to happen afterward. Alexander stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. Every instinct in him screamed to step forward, to say something, to ask Naomi what she was doing. He held himself still, afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was unfolding. Naomi finished half her plate and set the fork down gently. She didn't leave. She sat there, hands folded loosely in her lap, gaze lowered, giving Sophia space to exist without demand. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Sophia lifted her hand. The room seemed to freeze. Her fingers reached toward the spoon resting on her tray. They hovered there, trembling slightly, as if unsure whether they were allowed to continue. No one moved. No one breathed. Sophia's fingers closed around the spoon. She lifted it awkwardly, her movements unsteady from weeks of disuse. The spoon tipped, food threatening to spill. Naomi remained still, her face calm, her body relaxed, as though this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Sophia brought the spoon closer to her mouth. Alexander's vision blurred. The spoon touched her lips. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she took a bite. It was small, almost nothing, but it was real. The sound was so quiet it barely existed. The soft press of lips closing, the faint movement of chewing. But in that moment it was louder than anything that had filled the house in weeks. Tears spilled down Alexander's face as he covered his mouth, afraid that any sound might shatter the miracle in front of him. Naomi did not smile. She did not react. She simply sat beside the child and waited. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Sophia swallowed and stayed. By the fifth day, Naomi had learned the rhythm of Sophia's silence. She knew when the nurses would arrive with trays balanced carefully in their hands, when the room would tense, when every adult would lean forward without meaning to. She knew the exact moment Sophia's gaze would drift away, the calm certainty with which she closed herself off from the plate in front of her. And she knew what not to do. Naomi never touched the spoon meant for the child. She never knelt too close or spoke in that soft, pleading tone everyone else used. When food arrived, she did not look at Sophia at all. Instead, she brought her own small plate. She sat down on the low chair beside the table, not directly in front of Sophia, but close enough to share the space. She adjusted her posture slowly, as if every movement was intentional, as if there was all the time in the world. Then she began to eat. No performance, no encouragement, no words. Just the simple act of taking a bite, chewing quietly, and swallowing. At first, Sophia did nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the table, her hands resting where they always did. The room stayed tense, the nurses exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment pass. Naomi kept eating. She didn't rush, she didn't slow down either. She took each bite the same way, calmly, predictably, creating a rhythm that had nothing to do with expectation. After several minutes, Sophia's eyes flickered, just for a second. They moved from the table to Naomi's hands. Naomi noticed, but she did not respond. She continued eating, breathing evenly, her presence steady and unchanging. Another bite passed, then another. Sophia shifted in her chair, a small movement, barely noticeable. Her fingers curled slightly against the tray. Her eyes returned to Naomi, this time lingering longer, studying the way food moved from plate to mouth, the way nothing bad seemed to happen afterward. Alexander stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. Every instinct in him screamed to step forward, to say something, to ask Naomi what she was doing. He held himself still, afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was unfolding. Naomi finished half her plate and set the fork down gently. She didn't leave. She sat there, hands folded loosely in her lap, gaze lowered, giving Sophia space to exist without demand. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Sophia lifted her hand. The room seemed to freeze. Her fingers reached toward the spoon resting on her tray. They hovered there, trembling slightly, as if unsure whether they were allowed to continue. No one moved. No one breathed. Sophia's fingers closed around the spoon. She lifted it awkwardly, her movements unsteady from weeks of disuse. The spoon tipped, food threatening to spill. Naomi remained still, her face calm, her body relaxed, as though this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Sophia brought the spoon closer to her mouth. Alexander's vision blurred. The spoon touched her lips. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she took a bite. It was small, almost nothing, but it was real. The sound was so quiet it barely existed. The soft press of lips closing, the faint movement of chewing. But in that moment it was louder than anything that had filled the house in weeks. Tears spilled down Alexander's face as he covered his mouth, afraid that any sound might shatter the miracle in front of him. Naomi did not smile. She did not react. She simply sat beside the child and waited. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Sophia swallowed and stayed.
For a moment, no one moved. The spoon rested between Sophia's fingers, the metal trembling slightly, as if it carried more weight than it should. The room felt suspended, caught between before and after. Even the air seemed afraid to disturb what was happening. Sophia stared at the spoon, her expression unreadable. Weeks of silence had taught everyone not to expect anything from her too quickly. Hope had become dangerous. Hope hurt. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway. He had watched his daughter refuse food dozens of times. He had prepared himself for disappointment, for the familiar ache of watching her turn away again. His body braced for it, muscle memory tightening his chest. But she didn't turn away. Sophia lifted the spoon a little higher. Her hand wobbled, unsure, like she was remembering something she had forgotten how to do. The movement was slow, cautious, as if she feared the moment might vanish if she rushed it. Naomi stayed exactly where she was. She didn't lean in, she didn't nod, she didn't whisper encouragement. Her stillness was an anchor, a silent promise that nothing would be taken from Sophia, that no one would rush her or demand more than she was ready to give. Sophia's eyes flicked once toward Naomi's plate, then back to the spoon. Her lips parted. Alexander's breath caught painfully in his throat. The spoon touched Sophia's mouth. She paused there, hovering at the edge of decision. A heartbeat passed, then another. The room held its breath with her. And then she closed her lips around it. It was the smallest bite imaginable, barely enough to count as food. But it was a choice, a reaching back toward the world. Sophia pulled the spoon away and began to chew, slowly, uncertainly, as if she was testing whether this would hurt. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Her jaw moved once, twice. Alexander couldn't stop the sound that escaped him. It was a broken sob, sharp and sudden, torn from somewhere deep inside his chest. He covered his mouth with his hand, his shoulders shaking as tears spilled freely down his face. He had faced loss, failure, and fear before, but never like this. This wasn't relief. This was release. Weeks of helplessness collapsed all at once. The image of his daughter fading, the echo of doctor's words, the weight of every untouched plate. It all crashed into him as he watched her swallow. Sophia swallowed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply sat there, the smallest trace of effort passing through her body, as if she had crossed a bridge no one else could see. Naomi glanced at her then, just once, not to celebrate, not to react, only to acknowledge. Sophia's eyes met hers. For the first time in weeks, there was something there. Alexander slid down the wall of the doorway until he was crouched on the floor, overwhelmed. He pressed his forehead into his hand, his breath uneven, his heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and shame. He had been so close this whole time, so close, and yet so far away. Sophia rested the spoon back on the tray. She didn't reach for another bite, and no one asked her to, because this wasn't about how much she ate. It was about the fact that she had chosen to come back. And in that quiet, fragile moment, as a child reclaimed something everyone thought was lost, a father broke open and finally understood what it had cost to stand in the doorway for so long. The morning started to look different. Alexander found himself walking down the long hall toward Sophia's room before the day fully began, before the usual rush of calls and meetings demanded his attention. He would stand at the door, watching for a moment. The house seemed quieter, almost holding its breath as he stepped inside. Sophia lay in her crib, her small hands curled around the edges, her body so fragile against the soft sheets. He hadn't realized how much he had been avoiding her until now, how the weight of her silence had pulled him further away without him even knowing it. But now he sat. At first it felt awkward, unfamiliar. He didn't know how to be with her without the walls of business to hide behind. He wasn't sure what to say, how to fill the space between them, but sitting there, simply being present, was the first step he had taken in weeks that felt right. He started talking, but not in the way he thought he should. He didn't promise her anything. He didn't try to make her smile or laugh. He didn't try to fix anything. He just spoke, quietly, softly, about his day, about what he'd seen, about things that felt irrelevant, but real. He told her about the book he was reading, about the garden outside the house that was beginning to bloom again, about the old clock on the mantel that kept ticking away with the rhythm of time. He didn't expect answers, didn't expect any reaction, and that was the point. As the days passed, he began to stay longer. In the morning, when the staff would bustle through the house preparing for the day, he would sit by her crib, his eyes on her, his voice steady and soft. He didn't check his phone, he didn't make excuses, he just stayed. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It became something else, a quiet space for them both to exist without demands. He could feel her slowly beginning to trust him again, in small ways. Sometimes she would lift her eyes to meet his for a second. Sometimes she would reach out her hand, just a tiny gesture, but enough to show she was there. The nurses noticed the change, though they didn't say anything at first. They just watched from a distance as Alexander spent more time with his daughter. They saw how the atmosphere in the house shifted, how the fear that had hung over them all seemed to lighten just a little. Naomi, too, seemed to notice. She didn't speak about it, but when she passed by, she would give a subtle nod in Alexander's direction, a quiet approval of something she knew was important, something beyond any clinical diagnosis or prescribed solution. The real shift came when Alexander started taking Sophia into his arms. At first, it was gentle, cautious, like he was afraid he might break her. But then, as she responded to his touch, he began to hold her longer, to comfort her, to breathe with her. There were no words, no promises, just the weight of his presence, steady and warm. And Sophia responded in her own way. She would nestle into him for a few moments, then pull back slightly, still unsure but curious. She didn't speak, but her little hands would wrap around his fingers, holding on to him with a trust that grew stronger every day. The food came too, but it wasn't the food that mattered anymore. The meals were no longer battles, no longer struggles. Alexander didn't press her, he didn't rush her, he didn't force anything. He just waited. And when she reached for the spoon again, when she took a small bite, it was different. It wasn't about getting her to eat, it was about being there when she did. It was about learning how to be the father she needed, not the one he thought he was supposed to be. Sophia still ate slowly, still hesitated, but every bite was more than food. It was a choice to reconnect, to trust that the man sitting beside her wasn't going anywhere, that he would stay. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander believed it too. He believed he could stay, that he could show up for her in a way that mattered. That was enough. That was more than enough. The first meal that Sophia finished wasn't much. A few bites of toast with butter, the edges a little crisped. But for the first time in weeks, she finished it. The plate, once returned untouched, was empty. Alexander watched her, his hands trembling slightly as he set the plate down, but there was no mistaking the change. It was small, quiet, but it was real. Sophia looked up at him then, her big eyes holding his gaze for a moment longer than they had in days. She didn't smile, not yet, but something shifted in the stillness between them. She had taken the first step, not because she was told to, but because she had chosen to. Slowly she placed her small hand on the table, her fingers curling around the edges of the plate, as if grounding herself in something familiar. Alexander sat back in his chair, his heart light for the first time in ages. The weight in his chest lifted just a little. He hadn't realized how heavy it had been until this moment. The house, once filled with silence and tension, suddenly felt different. The air was less thick, the rooms less cold. It was as though the walls were breathing again. The staff noticed it too. The kitchen, once quiet and still during mealtimes, was now filled with soft chatter and the clinking of plates. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had been with the family for years, couldn't stop smiling when she passed by. Even the nurses, who had grown so accustomed to the long, uncertain days, felt a shift in the air. It was as though they could breathe easier now. Naomi continued her quiet work, sitting with Sophia whenever she needed, always there, but never forcing anything. She stayed in the background, as she always had, but it was clear to everyone that she had become something more than just a maid. She was a part of their healing, a reminder that sometimes the greatest medicine isn't found in prescriptions or diets, but in the simple act of showing up, quietly, without expectation.
Sophia's meals, once a battlefield, became part of the routine. It wasn't always easy. She still hesitated. She still had days when her appetite seemed to vanish, but there was no panic anymore, no fear that she would slip away into silence again. Each day brought a little more trust. Each meal, no matter how small, was a victory. The house felt warmer, not in the literal sense, though the radiators hummed with familiar warmth, but in a way that was deeper, softer. The coldness of grief had started to melt away, slowly but surely. The once echoing halls filled with laughter again, even if it was quiet at first. Alexander found himself smiling more, even when he wasn't sure why. There was a lightness in his chest, a sense that the storm had passed, though he knew there would be more days to face. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low, the family gathered in the living room. There was no rush, no urgency to leave. They sat together, Sophia nestled in the crook of Alexander's arm, her head resting on his shoulder. She wasn't talking much yet, but the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like something they could share. The house was no longer just a house, it was a home again. The laughter, when it came, was soft at first, small giggles from Sophia, a quiet sound that felt like a release after the long, hard silence. It wasn't loud, but it was there, growing, taking root, and with it, the house began to breathe again, filling with the life that had been missing for so long. Alexander looked around the room one evening, his eyes on his daughter, on Naomi, and on the warmth that had slowly returned to the house. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was real, and for the first time in months he believed it would be enough. Alexander had spent his life believing that money could fix anything, that with enough resources he could solve any problem, but in the end it wasn't money that saved his daughter. It wasn't doctors or specialists or the endless supply of expensive treatments. It was presence, his presence, sitting with her, waiting, showing up when everything else seemed to fail. Sophia didn't need more things, more distractions, more promises. She needed him to simply be there, to hold her in her pain without trying to fix it, and in that stillness, love was enough to heal what money never could. If this story moved you, take a moment to pause and share it with someone who might need it today. Stories like this remind us that presence can change lives in ways nothing else can. Subscribe for more powerful, heart-touching stories about love, loss, and second chances. Like this video to help it reach someone who's quietly struggling, and leave a comment. Sometimes a few words of kindness can be the reason someone keeps going.